So this is this lecture is about René Descartes. And René Descartes is a very, very important guy. Arguably, he's responsible for this movement we call modernism, which is the intellectual, philosophical movement that basically is the reason why people in Europe and America and Australia and Canada and what we call the developed nations, why we live the way we do, and people in, say, places like Saudi Arabia live the way they do. René Descartes is the guy who sort of set the stage for, well, just about everything that's, most of the things that are good anywhere, like democratic government, public sanitation, public education, secular education, the scientific method, they were either a result of Descartes or they received a great big boost from Descartes, because Descartes was the guy who wrote a book that transformed what we call the intelligentsia, the intellectual class of Europe, and he introduced method into thinking. It is the idea, if you think about stuff, you should be methodical, you should discover the rules of thought. And although he didn't invent logic, didn't invent mathematics, he made enormous contributions to mathematics, by the way. Without him, calculus would not have been possible, for instance. But he was the guy who made it really popular to use logic, to think logically about things, to base conclusions on logically good arguments rather than authorities. And consequently, he's very, very deeply hated by a number of people around the world nowadays. Now, and I mention this because I am going to tell you about something Descartes got wrong. René Descartes' philosophy, in many ways, is a blind alley. He did some, what I consider brilliant work, genius work, that happened to support wrong conclusions. So, to me, René Descartes is brilliantly wrong. And I'm going to be telling you about stuff he did that was wrong. Now, you remember the Meno, right? Plato and the slave boy, and this is the argument for innate ideas, and the soul and immortality, and it's all based on the assumption that a slave boy cannot figure something out for himself if he's got a mathematician dropping enormous hints and suggestions and almost, pretty much telling him what to do. And Descartes' arguments turn out to be, well, not as bad as that, but in my view, they're still wrong, and they still lead to wrong conclusions. But that doesn't mean he wasn't a genius. He was. He was one of the great geniuses of history. If you study Descartes, even his philosophy is very well written, very well thought out. And just like Plato, in the time that Descartes lived, nobody knew that this way of arguing was bad. It's like using old techniques of building. If you go and look at old buildings and the way things were built, I don't know, 40 years ago, 50 years, 100 years ago, you go, we'd never do it like that. That'd be far too expensive, or it wouldn't work. You know, they used to use aluminum for wiring. There are houses that burned down because somebody attached aluminum to copper, and the resulting heat made sparks and flames, and it caught the wood frames on fire. It's quite spectacular, fun to watch. But right, so Descartes made an enormous contribution. He'll always be an important philosopher. Largely, it's a matter of reacting to Descartes that drives a lot of drives a lot of philosophy, because Descartes set the stage. His philosophy was pretty much dominant for a number of years, and it is still considered very important. I consider it completely wrong, and that is the tack I'm going to take in this lecture. Yes?
Do most people consider Descartes wrong in the way you do?
I really have no idea. I haven't done a survey. Most philosophers I know about are materialists, and Descartes was not a materialist. So most philosophers that I know about who operate today would consider Descartes to be wrong about the things we're talking about here. Mathematics, you talk to a mathematician, and Descartes is possibly the most important mathematician ever. You know that XY grid thing you do in algebra? Yeah, he invented that. He was the guy who figured, hey, we don't have to do it just as numbers here. We can actually lay out a matrix and have it like this. So he made a lot of branches of mathematics possible. Right? Way, way, way smarter than I am. But these particular arguments. So what I'm going to do, and he's very, very important in philosophy, because there's this idea of method, being methodical. Now, philosophers even today are not always methodical, but if you look, but there's a realization that we should be methodical. If you look at the rules of philosophy that I gave earlier in the semester, and I said Martin's rules of philosophy, that's my attempt to be methodical, to say, look, here are some rules you should follow. If you're not doing this, if you're doing this, you're not doing it right. There's a mistake here that we should do. We should avoid mistakes. Right? There needs to be some set of guidelines, some understanding of what leads to right answers and what leads to wrong answers. And that's another thing I'm going to try and discuss today. I'm going to discuss the kinds of arguments Descartes gave, which are a kind of argument that virtually nobody gives today. It's also a kind of argument that no scientist would ever give. Right? One of the comparisons between science and philosophy is that because science is so closely linked to evidence, if a scientist goes wrong, you can do an experiment and prove him wrong. We can't do that in philosophy. So when I look back at the history of philosophy, I see some people who are like going on the straight and narrow, being very methodical, following logic out exactly right. And then I see some people going, wee, off into left field, and I go, you have just that no. Right? It's like you're doing it totally. It's like watching a baseball game, except instead of waving the bats and hitting the ball or spitting or whatever it is they do. I'm very hazy on the rules of baseball. I've never figured out when they're supposed to spit. And in what direction. I just, but they're juggling. You got a guy over here juggling the bats, and somebody's throwing the balls at seagulls or pigeons or something like that. It's like, no, you're doing it wrong. And say, no, this is baseball. This is the World Series. Yay! And you go, no. Unless that is the way they do the World Series.
Pretty close.
Okay, thank you. What? No. Damn. My lack of sports knowledge has embarrassed me again. So this is sort of an example of a brilliant person doing it wrong, and then I'm going to try and talk about how he did it wrong. Oh, and the contribution, be methodical. And he was methodical. Right, so René Descartes, and I guess the first thing to mention here is what I call the quest for certainty. Now, if you Descartes, part of his idea of philosophy is he wanted to be certain. He thought that if something's knowledge, it's certain. Oh, I haven't. Could I get you to sacrifice pass around a sign-up sheet? So he thought knowledge had to be certain. And so he's making this quest for certainty. And this is actually a very important step in the history of philosophy, because the only way to find out if we can have certainty of our knowledge about the universe and about what's in it and so on, the only way to find out if we can have certainty is to try and get it. Right? You're standing on the roof of one building, and your buddy asks, can you jump that? Well, what's the only way to try? The only way to find out? No, it's to measure it and then mark it out on the ground. I'm not jumping over to another building. Are you crazy? So this is part of Descartes' important contribution to philosophy, is that he proved that something couldn't be done. Because if Descartes can't get certainty, nobody can. So he's trying to find certainty. Now, have you ever been in if you're an expert in something, if you're really well informed about something, you might have an experience like this. Going into a bookstore and starting looking around the books in your area of expertise and the stuff you know about. I know quite a bit about firearms. I know quite a bit about military history. There's a number of things I know quite a bit about. And I go into a bookstore, and I have these frustrating experiences because they'll have these books that are on sale. Ooh, this is a great book. Lots of pictures of guns or tanks or something. I like looking at that. And then I start looking at the text. It's like, well, this is a coffee table book. This guy has copied chunks of information from other sources, and he's not really telling me very much. And then if you read through these things, you look and say, well, wait, this is wrong. So I could get this book, but I'd be really frustrated by it, because there's bits where it's wrong, it's incomplete, it's not telling me anything I don't know, and it's really shallow. So you can, and this is with philosophy books or history books, it's like there's books that are written by people who actually understand history, and then there are books that are written by people who want to sensationalize things or just don't know what they're talking about. Right? And you can imagine, now imagine that if your university, the college library was like that, or a university research library was like that. It says, hey, we're the research library, we've got all the things. And you go in there, and some of it's good data, it's really well researched, it's based on proper understanding of the available evidence. And some of it's just pulled out of thin air. The stuff is just, it just seems to be just made up. Now, when René Descartes was active, he could go into any, like a university library or a private academic library, and look through the volumes, and some of them would seem to be pretty good, and others would seem to be complete rubbish. And he'd go over people's beliefs, and some of them were pretty good, seemed to be pretty solid, and others were complete rubbish. Well, it was rather like the internet. Or as I call it, the information landfill. Because like 90%, if you sample random web pages, 90% of the information you come across will be absolute garbage. And this is why I tell students, when you are thinking about your Odyssey paper, you do not take the topic and Google it, because you'll come up with hundreds, perhaps thousands, of web pages or blogs written by complete morons who don't have any understanding of philosophy or the topic that they're trying to talk about, but they will talk about it. And they'll talk like they know what they're doing, and they don't. Right? I call this trolling for morons. internet's full of morons, you can't take a throw out of random. I don't know what would be throwing a stick on the internet, but if you could throw sticks on the internet, you couldn't throw one without hitting at least 2 morons. So there's this terrible state of knowledge at the time of Descartes, and he's trying to set out to fix it. So this leads to another brilliant idea by Descartes. It's absolutely brilliant. It didn't go anywhere, but it's not something we turned out to be able to do, but it's an absolutely brilliant idea. It's called methodological doubt. Right, now you guys should be aware of the distinction between entertaining and accepting an idea. When you entertain an idea, you're thinking about it. When you accept an idea, you're believing it. Right? You're saying, okay, from now on I'm going to believe this. I'm going to act on the assumption that this is true. I'm going to speak on the assumption that this is true. So that there are certain ideas that you accept. I mean, you can reject it again later, but while you're accepting an idea, you're believing it. That's the same kind of thing, right? So acceptance is like belief. Entertaining an idea is sort of being aware of its existence and maybe thinking about it. Right? So you can entertain lots of ideas and accept none of them. Right? Methodological doubt is he sets up a rule for himself. René Descartes will only accept an idea if that idea is known with absolute logical certainty. And I put the word logical here to distinguish it from emotional certainty. Have you ever been so certain of an idea that you could not accept the possibility that it was wrong, and then it turned out to be wrong? I've done that. I was so sure that I bought this thing, and then this other thing comes in the mail, and in fact, I've been wrong so many times. I try not to be certain about anything. So that's methodological doubt. Only accept certain. When I say certain, I mean there's no possibility of doubting it. Undoubtable. In fact, I'm going to change that. Sorry. Undoubt. Only accept undoubtable ideas and the logical implications. Okay, only accept undoubtable ideas and the logical implications of those ideas, and you will build, in parenthesis, certain knowledge. again, quest for certainty, he wants to have absolute certainty. So there's a lot of things in this world about which we are pretty sure. In fact, about which we are very, very sure. For instance, I'm pretty sure that Bakersfield exists, because I visited a city that I was told was Bakersfield. There was a sign outside that said Bakersfield. There were signs, is it the 101, or is it the, leading up to Bakersfield that says Bakersfield, 20 miles, Bakersfield here. Look out, you're about to enter Bakersfield, better not slow down. Maybe I imagined that sign. But you're right, so there's a lot of evidence added up, and I'm pretty sure Bakersfield. I'm even more sure that Los Angeles exists. And I'm very, very, very sure that this classroom exists. Well, Descartes might say, at this point in time, are you sure you're not in the matrix? You're not in a tank with electrodes hooked up to your brain, feeding you things? Or are you sure you're not in a digital person in a computer simulation? And I said, well, I guess I could be, but it's really ridiculous. It's really ridiculously unlikely. And Descartes says, aha! That's a tiny little bit of doubt. And he only needs a tiny, tiny little bit of doubt to say it's not certain. If something can be doubted at all, well, it can be doubted, right? If a shield, if a field, if a cloth, a sheet is a little bit gray, even undetectably gray, well, then it's a little bit gray, and it's not completely white. It's not absolutely white. So a little, and think about even the tiniest, tiniest little doubts you can have. So he wants something certain. Now, that quest for certainty, that's a hallmark of rationalism. Right. And this is where I want to point out, rationalism is not the idea that we should be rational. That's just not being stupid. Right? Rationalism, everybody should be rational. Everybody thinks everybody should be rational, especially other people. I don't know of any, there's no doctrine in philosophy that says we should not be rational, or even that it's okay not to be rational when we're doing philosophy. Rationalism is the idea, partly, is the idea that we can have certainty and should accept nothing else. So the quest for certainty is part of rationalism.
Can you say that one more time?
Sure.
Rationalism?
The quest for certainty is characteristic of rationalism. The contrasting doctrine of empiricism, which we will study after the exam, I guess. Oh my God, there's an exam. There's a midterm. There's a midterm next week. I better write it.
We can skip it.
Yeah. Oh, that's why I need to put. That's why I need to put that, to fix that web page so it has the right sample questions on it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Got to have those sample questions. If they're not up there tomorrow, if they're still wrong tomorrow, please feel free to email me, because I should fix that. Well, not tonight, but early tomorrow morning I should fix that.
If it's not fixed, there's no midterm?
Say again?
If it's not fixed and there's no midterm?
Couldn't make that out.
If it's not fixed and there's no midterm?
That doesn't know. There will be a midterm. And I will,
Are you certain?
Yeah.
not absolutely, for instance, the Earth could be hit by a comet between now and then. There are, more likely an asteroid, because there are several dozen near-Earth asteroid passes every year. I mean, not really near. They usually don't come inside the moon's orbit, but pretty close, astronomically speaking. Yes?
You were saying, I just wanted to get the one sentence.
Yeah.
Rationalism is the idea that we can have certainty.
Rationalism is characterized by a number of different doctrines. You add them all together and you get rationalism. One element of rationalism is the quest for certainty. We could have certainty, and we will have certainty, say the rationalists. And the empiricists say, yeah, call me when you do. The next thing is rejection of the senses. And again, this is part of rationalism. So rejection of the senses. All right, and I want to put in, well, I guess I'll write it in here in blue. Rejection of the senses. A very important part of rationalism is that rationalism rejects the senses. And I'm going to write in what seems to be their argument. All right, down here. Oh. Now, one way of characterizing the rationalist argument against the senses is to say that the fact that we know that the senses are not always reliable. Have you ever made a sensory error? Like thought someone across the quad was your friend, and you wave, and then you realize it's someone different. And you just, I wasn't waving. You try to look like. And so I've made sensory errors, and you know, there's things look one way at one angle and then different at another angle. Things turn out, you think it's one, you think a paper bag in the road is a cat, so you steer towards it only to be disappointed. I don't do that. I once scandalized my class by referring to a device I thought up called a kitty catapult. It's a device for catapulting a cat onto a roof or into a neighbor's yard or something like that. Probably useful for pranks. So senses are not always reliable, and so the rationalists say, look, they're not always reliable. So anytime you make an argument based on the senses, I'm going to ask you, can you be certain on this? And you're going to say, no. I can't be absolutely certain. Because my senses, I know my senses have been fooled sometimes, and I cannot prove they're not being fooled now. And an empiricist say, well, I might say, well, but I can get a dozen people together, and I can have them look at these two pens, and they'll all say, and what if they all say that these two pens are the same color? And the empiricist says, the rationalist says, well, is it impossible for 12 people to make the same mistake? And the answer is, it's very unlikely. And I didn't ask if it was unlikely, I asked, is it impossible? No, it's not impossible. Aha, says the rationalist, you can't be certain here. Okay. That's the sort of the difference in attitude. An empiricist will be like, well, look, we're pretty sure of it. Let's go with it. And the rationalist will say, no, you don't have knowledge. You have a belief. Maybe it's probably true. I could allow that. But it's not certain, so it's not really knowledge. And that is actually one of the big themes of philosophy over a couple of thousand years, is that philosophy wants certainty. Right? And there's a reason we call the philosophers, basically before Locke, rationalists, and we had to have a new name for the people who came in afterwards, for Locke and his followers, because the empiricists are the people who give up the quest for certainty. We go a different direction. But for Descartes and the rationalists, because they have the quest for certainty, and the senses cannot guarantee certainty, they cannot give absolute certainty, the senses are rejected. So that's two elements of rationalism, and you basically have seen two elements of rationalism, the quest for certainty and the rejection of the senses, and they're linked, right? Because the quest for certainty is what leads them to reject the senses. Right. René Descartes rejects something else that other rationalists don't necessarily reject. And I'm going to put it this way as interesting and interesting confusion. So I'm going to try and get back to this later in the class if there's time. But Descartes, let's see if I can do this together. Descartes, in his meditation, talks about rejecting mathematics. Did you see that in the book?
Yeah.
Descartes rejects mathematics.
Bad genius, evil genius.
Say again?
The evil genius?
Yes, the evil genius. Oh, good. Thank you for reminding me about that. I'll bring in the evil genius. I don't like the term evil genius. I prefer misunderstood genius. Because it sounds pretty cool to me. I wish I had that power. Seriously, wouldn't that be great? You know, if you had like an eyeglass or a monocle that could say, you say, you know, you're a guy in a hat. I say, no, I'm an elephant. And they go, oh crap, an elephant, and it's talking. Wouldn't that be cool? I mean, the most amazing thing ever. I want that power. Right. So, all right. Let's bring in the evil genius. He's happy, kind of mad looking. Let's give him horns because I like horns. That looks terrible. The evil. And the evil genius, or also known as, I actually prefer this, it's also known as the demon deceiver. I forget what Descartes actually called him. All right. Can fool your senses about anything, any, right. So I'm going to try and explain how the demon deceiver figures in Descartes' explanation of why he does not trust mathematics. Now, first to understand, the evil genius isn't part of his argument, it's part of his explanation of his argument. And Descartes' books, a colleague of mine from grad school called Dave Cunning wrote his dissertation on this, that when Descartes talks about his books being meditations, he is actually leading the reader through a thought process. So that it's basically, well, think about this. Okay, how does that work out? Now think about this. Okay. And so Descartes is trying to create sort of a dialogue between him and the reader, where he's sort of in the position of Socrates, and the reader is in the position of Theaetetus, except that the Theaetetus here is supposed to actually do some thinking, and Socrates is not such a jerk about it. So, so that's what Descartes is trying to do, and he says, look, think about what if there was an evil genius, just as a hypothetical question, right? What if there was an evil genius? So I'm going to try and explain that, the example. We think 3 plus 5 equals 8 because every time we put 3 apples with 5 oranges, we see 8 pieces of fruit. But isn't it also possible? Isn't it also possible that 3 fruits plus 5 fruits makes 9, and the demon deceiver makes us see 8? Question mark. And when I say possible, I mean logically possible. Well, actually, I mean physically possible too. When I say possible, I mean, can we rule it out? At this stage, if we can't rule it out, then it's possible. Now, what Descartes is saying is, all right, I've got 3 pens here and 5 pens here. I guess I'm going to. These are the pens you have, and in real life we add them together, and there's 8. Why? Because that's just the way the world is. All right. Now you can see here that Descartes isn't paying much attention to physical evidence, right? Because he doesn't pay much attention to the senses. If we say, well, if he says, well, if you say, well, can you? He said, no, I can prove it. It has to be 8 because that's how mathematics works. And Descartes says, I know that's how mathematics work, but can you prove that that's how the way the world works? See, we grew up several hundred years after Descartes, right? And we're in what's basically a European society. It's founded on basically the English. It's created by the English over in the original colonies. And we're given scientific educations, or an education that at least gives some attention to scientific and ideas, and most of what we believe is scientific and observational. But Descartes didn't live in that world. Right? He was one of the people who made our world, but he didn't live in our world. And so the idea, for instance, it was a common, I believe it was a common belief in Descartes' time, that if you put a bunch of old socks in a drawer and left it alone for a while, it would spontaneously generate mice. Mice would appear out of your old socks. They didn't move in and have babies, they made the mice there. It's called spontaneous generation. And there were a lot of beliefs out there. People believed in demonic possession. oh, God, I don't think they didn't really know what caused disease at this time. So, in Descartes' world, and actually kind of logically, we can't really, it was a sort of a not out of the question kind of idea to think that adding 3 apples to 5 oranges would make 9 pieces of fruit. Nobody ever saw it happen, but Descartes takes care of that with the demon deceiver. Yeah, of course nobody sees it happen because the demon deceiver is. So you're asked to suppose 2 things. Suppose that 3 plus 5 actually makes 9, and suppose there's a demon deceiver that controls our senses to make us see 8 instead of 9. Right? Think about that scenario. Now, can we prove that that scenario isn't true? We can't do it by adding apples to oranges because the scenario says we will see 8. But it denies that that's true. So can you prove? I can't, at least not at this point in time. So this is why Descartes rejects mathematics as a foundation of knowledge, because for Descartes, mathematics is actually not certain. All right, how many of you are weirded out by this? You're paying attention. Yeah, I find it very weird too. Every time I teach this class, I have to stop every time, just sort of think about that and let it reverberate around inside my skull. But he's really serious about it. He rejects mathematics as a foundation for knowledge. Yes?
Can they even prove that there is a demon deceiver?
He doesn't have to. It only has to be. Remember, we're talking about methodological doubt. It's a very good question. He does not prove that there's a demon deceiver. He does not believe that there's a demon deceiver. But at this stage in the meditation, it's not ruled out. It's possible. The kind of argument he's giving only requires that the demon deceiver be possible. If you get to a point in the argument where he can prove the demon deceiver is impossible, then he's golden, right? He can discard it. But until you can rule it out, it's always a possibility. Think about a medical diagnosis, right? You go into the doctor and he says you might have this or this or this or this, right? I don't know. It might be cancer. It might be the minge. The grip. It might be the grip. It might be Mopari. And it's like, well, cancer, that would be horrible. Yeah. Well, it's a possibility until we rule it out. So you take more tests. Later on, so before the follow-up tests, it's like, could be cancer, could be cancer, could be cancer. Later on, if the follow-up test rules out cancer, it's like, okay, we don't have to think about cancer anymore. But until it's ruled out, you have to think about it. And that's what Descartes is saying here. You have to think about this, and it's a possibility thing. He's looking for certainty. He's trying to sweep away everything that's uncertain, that could be uncertain. All right. So this gets into Descartes' next stage. Descartes is looking for certainty. He's looking for a proposition that he thinks that cannot be false. Looking for a proposition that cannot be false. You guys know what I mean by proposition? It's a statement, a claim. Now, what follows is the most brilliant, Descartes' most brilliant contribution to philosophy, and it is actually certifiably brilliant, and there's just two things wrong with it. One is it's not exactly right, and two, it's even if it was right, it doesn't prove what he wants to prove. So just give you some foreshadowing there. So evil genius is still around at this point. All right. All right. So now, is it possible, logically, remember the evil genius and everything, is it possible that your physical body doesn't exist? Sure, we have this idea, it's a very, very old idea in science fiction of being inside a tank and having all your experiences fed to you, or even being a digital being. There's a movie, a really good movie called The 13th Floor, that explores this in a very interesting way. It's a pretty good movie, and it covers this very well. But, and I think you can get it on Hulu for free. That should be an H. Now, the key here is, if I doubt myself, can I doubt that I'm doubting? Can I doubt that I'm doubting? Can I doubt that there is an entity here doing the doubting? Because what would happen if there was no entity? Can I doubt my own existence as a stream of thought or as a mind? But what happens if I doubt? What am I saying? What would I be saying? Because every time there's a doubt, there's an alternative. If I say I doubt my physical existence, well, I exist just as a mind, maybe a digital one in a computer, or a disembodied soul, depending on your supernatural beliefs. There's an alternative. But if I don't exist to do the doubting, I won't be doubting. I have to exist to doubt. Or I have to exist at least to think. Now, so in French, it's je pense. I hope I'm getting this right. I'll throw in an accent. That'll make it look better. Donc, je suis. Je pensais donc je suis. And I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but I've got a pronunciation that sounds good to me. Je pensais donc je suis, which is I think, most famous slogan, all of them. I think, therefore I am, I think, hence I am, or Cogito Ergo Sum. Sorry. Emma only has one bump, only has two bumps. Cogito Ergo Sum. I think, therefore I am, or thinking, therefore existence. Think, so exist. So, now, this is actually brilliant. It's one of the deepest insights ever given in philosophy, and so it's one of the great contributions to philosophy. However, I will argue that it actually doesn't get us anywhere. And but first, and I'm going to tell you what Descartes does with this.
I
So, I'm going to put this actually in purple. At this point, Descartes thinks that he's proved his mind exists, and I would say he's right or wrong, depending on what you mean by mind. And I really, you have to look at that word there, mind, and think about what you mean by mind, or what Descartes might mean by mind. Think about whether he actually has proved this. Now, I'm never really sure how to fit all this stuff in together. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do what's called the wax example, or the wax argument. This is the wax argument for innate ideas. And again, innate ideas are ideas that come to you that are we know that the mind exists. Now he's going to try and prove that innate ideas exist. So he's going to make a second premise for this argument, and it's called the wax argument. So the way it goes, Descartes says something like, imagine a piece of wax, a piece of actual, you guys know what beeswax looks like? All right. Good, because this drawing is not going to come out at all well. All right. So this is the, imagine a piece of beeswax, fresh from the comb. It smells like bees smell, and you can also smell the honey on it. If you lick it, it tastes of honey, and it's relatively hard. Bang it on a hard surface, you'll hear a noise. And it has a distinct shape and color. Now, Descartes says, you take this wax, you take it indoors, take it near the fire, and as it goes, it loses its shape a little bit, right? It's no longer hard; it's soft. Right? The smell goes away. After a while, you can't taste you can't taste honey on it anymore. It becomes tasteless, and eventually, you take it right by the fire, stick it down next to the fire. It will turn into a colorless, odorless, shapeless puddle of liquid, not a solid at all. And if we call this A, and this B, and this C, the wax argument says A is the same thing as C. A is C. This is this, right? This is the wax, this is the wax, this is the wax. And we know it's the and we know it's the same thing. So we have a piece of knowledge, and we know it's the same thing. We know it's the same thing. But its sensory properties are all different. Its sensory properties are all different. Okay. And so Descartes does this experiment in front of you, and he says, here's the wax at A, and we call that A, and then we have the wax at the end of the process, call it C. Is C the same thing as A? And you're supposed to say yes. And he'll ask, how do you know it's the same thing? And you're not supposed to answer that. Because you're supposed to say, I don't know. And so Descartes will ask you, do you know it's the same thing from your senses? So we know it's the same thing, but we look at this. This doesn't have any sensory properties in common with this. You can't say, well, it's the same shape, or it's the same color, or it smells the same, or it tastes the same, or it has the same consistency, or the same rigidity. It has no sensory properties in common. So Descartes says, we don't know this through the senses. So, oops, we don't know that A is C through the senses. We don't know that A is C through the senses, so it's an innate idea. We don't know this is we know this thing, we don't know it from the senses, so it's an innate idea. What argument does this remind you of? Okay? What argument does this remind me of? Say again?
Socrates
Yes.
and,
It starts with S. The slave boy, the
For
Mino.
example,
Say again?
slave boy and the
The
example.
slave boy, yeah, the mathematical problem. Oh, he couldn't possibly have known it from being told. You know, he couldn't possibly have figured it out for himself, and he's never learned mathematics. I certainly didn't tell him the solution. Well, yes, you did. Right. So this is an example of a rationalist argument. It's a very famous rationalist argument. I'm not saying it's the best rationalist argument. And I'm going to try and, I'm actually going to try and break it down. So this is Descartes' argument for innate ideas, the famous wax example. Can anyone see anything wrong with this? Do you guys understand how it's supposed to prove innate ideas? We know that that's the wax. We know that C is A. Right. What's wrong with this argument? Does the argument actually work? Well, imagine somebody comes late for the lecture, or has to go to the bathroom in the middle of the lecture, and they come in, and Descartes asks everyone, do you know that this is the wax? And the guy at the back says, no, I don't know that it's the wax. And Descartes says, well, of course you know it's the wax. It's the wax. And the guy says, no, I wasn't here the whole time. I had to go outside for a smoke. And I didn't see you carry the thing. I didn't see what you did. Right? So I don't know it's the wax. Is that implausible? Right? If if Descartes held up a piece of wax at the beginning of a lecture, and you ducked out for a smoke, and then you come back in, and he says, well, we know this puddle over here is the wax I had at the beginning. Would you know it's the wax he had at the beginning?
No, it doesn't look or smell or even resemble the same.
Yeah, but if you had, so you wouldn't know. Right? You would not know. Descartes says you'd know, but you wouldn't know. How does he know? Well, I'll tell you, that sounded plausible. Does that story sound plausible to you, that you would know that it's the wax if I had a piece of wax and I trumped it around and I did everything in front of your eyes and it got softer and stopped smelling and suddenly got liquid and stuff and it was just a puddle on the floor? That's a plausible story, right? And you say, hey, you can imagine saying, hey, I know that's the same wax because you watched it change. You were watching it the whole time. So, imagine that there's an evil genius while Descartes is doing this experiment. And Descartes looks at this and says, this is this color and this shape and da 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 da. And just in the middle of it, the evil genius goes, yoink, puts in another piece of wax, a different piece of wax. Maybe a piece of wax that looks the same, but the evil genius is like, I just pulled away the wax and gave a different one. Right? And Descartes says, look, this is the same piece of wax. We all know this. But in this scenario, we actually don't. Or imagine that someone knocks on the door, while Descartes is doing this. And Descartes says, excuse me, I've got to look at this. And he goes and puts the wax down, and someone comes up and puts in another bit of wax, and Descartes comes back and he says, okay, and he picks up the new wax without looking closely and says, okay, and now we take it over here, right? We have two pieces of wax that look like B, and someone substitutes one. It goes, right? And see, here it's the same wax. We know it's the same wax. And the answer is, we only know it's the same wax if we were watching the whole time. And we can't be, because of the evil genius possibility, the possibility of the evil genius, we actually don't know it's the same wax. We can't know for certain that it's the same wax. We don't have this knowledge, so we don't have this knowledge that didn't come from the senses. Descartes just failed. Now the Cogito Ergo Sum, brilliant argument. I can't find anything wrong with that. You have to exist in order to doubt something. What the nature of that existence, not established. But there has to be some existence for doubt to exist. So something got to exist. But this, no, it doesn't work, because the way we know that this is the same object, if we do, is by watching it every step of the way. But the evil genius could be swapping these out. Or someone could be swapping them out. Someone could be coming up and changing the wax, and the evil genius is altering Descartes' perceptions the whole time. It looks like the same wax. He's not holding he's not holding wax at all. He's holding an angry chicken that is shaking around, and he thinks it's the wax because the evil genius is intervening. So the wax argument falls down because the knowledge that he's talking about is actually acquired by the senses. It's
right.
Right. And what he is doing, and by the way, this is, I should make this a rule, but I can't figure out how to make it a rule. But what he's doing is ignoring possibilities. He's ignoring information. He's ignoring things that could be true. I think that is a rule. He's ignoring the possibility that he's basically setting a set of rules. If knowledge comes from the senses, it has to come from comparing sensory properties. Right? So if that's the case, someone dings your car while you're in class, and you come out and there's a ding, right? Oh, there's something wrong with my perception of the car. I'm perceiving a slightly different car. Maybe it's not my car. That doesn't make sense. We make up, how do you know your car is your car when you go out? Well, it's in the same place and it's the same appearance. Which means it would be a pretty mean trick to play on someone. They go off somewhere where you know they're going to be out of the way for 8 hours, and you take the car and put new wheels on it, give it a new paint job, polish it up, polish the dings out of the windows, give it a quick wash, and then put it back in exactly the same spot. Right? And he walks up. Well, it won't work if he's got one of those remote controls, because bim bim, where's my car? That's my car. Bim bim, it's like, oh crap, it's got my stuff in it. There's a different. It's terrible. It won't work. You have to have someone who doesn't have a remote control for this trick. He said, dude, this is your car. So there's the wax argument. Now, but wait, there's more, and it's even more wild. So let's take a break and come back at 4 minutes past 8 by the clock. I'm going to start lecturing again at 4 minutes past 8. If you come back after then, come in.